Hello and welcome. Tonight, we invite you on a journey into one of the most chilling and misunderstood chapters of the 20th century: life inside the infamous gulags of Stalin's Soviet Union. These prison camps stretched across the vast frozen terrain of the USSR, holding millions of men and women in conditions that were beyond comprehension. Before we begin, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps us grow this channel and bring more thoughtful, relaxing content your way. And while you're at it, give this video a like if you find it interesting. In the comments, let us know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is as you drift off to sleep. We'd love to hear from you. To understand what life was like inside Stalin's gulags, we must begin not at the gates of the camps, but far earlier, at the roots of a regime that would make these camps not only possible, but central to its vision of control. The word Gulag is an acronym. It stands for Glavnoye Upravlenie Lagerai, or Main Camp Administration. It wasn't a single place, but rather a vast network of forced labor camps that spread across the Soviet Union, from the icy wastes of Siberia to the remote deserts of Central Asia. Between 1929 and 1953, the Gulag became a state within a state, swallowing up millions. But it didn't start as a massive machine of repression. In the early days of the Soviet Union, following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the new government was eager to consolidate its power. Prisons were already crowded with enemies of the old regime and political opponents of the new one. Lenin himself authorized the creation of the first corrective labor camps in 1919. These early camps were modest in size but brutal in nature. The idea was simple: make prisoners work. Reform would come not through education or rehabilitation, but through toil. When Joseph Stalin came to power in the late 1920s, the scale of this system began to change. Stalin was a man obsessed with control. He distrusted not only his enemies, but also his allies. To build the Soviet state he envisioned, centralized, industrialized, and unchallenged, he needed two things: fear and labor. The Gulag would provide both. Stalin launched a series of 5-year plans, massive efforts to industrialize the Soviet economy. These plans required roads, railways, factories, and mines. And the Soviet state lacked both the manpower and the capital to build them. But it had something else: a growing prison population. People were being arrested for reasons that defied logic. You could be imprisoned for telling a joke about the regime, for arriving late to work too many times, or simply for being related to someone who had been declared an enemy of the people. During the Great Purge of the late 1930s, these arrests became a flood. Writers, teachers, farmers, soldiers, no one was safe. Interrogations were swift and brutal. Confessions were often obtained through torture. Once a confession was signed, you were sentenced, not in open court, but through paperwork processed by bureaucrats. The sentence almost always involved labor, hard labor, in the farthest reaches of the Soviet Empire. Prisoners were packed into trains, boxcars with no seats, no heat, and barely any food. The journey to the camps could take weeks. Some did not survive it. Those who did were often delivered to camps still under construction, meaning their first task was to build the very barracks that would imprison them. Imagine waking up in absolute darkness, the frigid air biting your face before your eyes even open. There's no blanket, your clothing is thin, the same set you've worn for weeks, caked with dirt, frozen with sweat. You haven't felt truly warm in months. The bell rings outside. It's not even dawn. It never is. And yet, the guards shout, "Narabotu!" To work. This was the start of every day in the Gulag. The camps were designed not for punishment, but for exploitation. Their central purpose was labor. Prisoners were sent to build canals, fell forests, mine gold, dig coal, and construct roads through the wilderness. Each task was grueling. There was little to no mechanization. Everything was done by hand: pickaxes, shovels, wheelbarrows. The cold was constant. In winter, temperatures in Siberia could fall below -40 degrees Celsius. Fingers froze to tools. Breathing could burn your lungs. In summer, the mud sucked your boots from your feet, and clouds of mosquitoes filled the air. The guards did not care if you lived or died. What they cared about was your norma, your labor quota. Every day, each prisoner was assigned a certain output: a volume of earth to dig, a length of track to lay, a number of trees to cut down. Meeting your norma was nearly impossible. But failing it, that meant less food. It was a cruel arithmetic. The weaker you became, the less you could work. The less you worked, the less you ate. And the less you ate, the closer you came to death. Food in the Gulag was a weapon. Rations were meager to begin with. A piece of bread, a cup of watery soup, maybe a spoonful of porridge. If you exceeded your labor quota, you might get an extra slice of bread. If you fell short, the ration could be cut to starvation levels. Hunger dominated every thought. Many prisoners chewed leather belts or boiled grass in desperation. Others resorted to even more desperate measures. There are recorded instances of cannibalism in some of the remotest camps. Clothing was a patchwork of whatever could be found. There was no issue of proper boots, gloves, or winter coats. Prisoners wrapped their feet in rags and tied them with rope. If a prisoner died, his coat was stripped and reused, sometimes before his body had even gone cold. But the physical misery was only part of the suffering. The psychological toll was immense. Most prisoners had no idea how long they would remain in the camps. Sentences were often vague, and extensions were common. Some were sentenced to 10 years, only to find themselves rearrested before release on trumped-up charges and sentenced again. The fear was constant, and the isolation complete. Letters from family were rare. Many prisoners' families were arrested themselves or forced to disown their relatives to avoid persecution. Betrayal was common. The system encouraged prisoners to inform on each other in exchange for minor privileges, a cigarette, an extra slice of bread. Entire friendships were destroyed by whispered accusations. Paranoia became the rule. To trust was to risk your life. Violence was everywhere. The guards were often brutal and indifferent, quick to beat or shoot prisoners for minor infractions. But perhaps even more dangerous were the other prisoners. The Gulag system did not separate political prisoners, intellectuals, teachers, factory workers from violent criminals. In fact, career criminals known as blatniye were given favored status in many camps. These men formed hierarchies of power inside the barracks. They controlled access to food, tools, and protection. Political prisoners were often their victims, extorted or brutalized daily. And then there was the cold. Cold so deep it became a force of its own. Not just discomfort, but pain, silence, madness. The cold got into your bones, into your dreams. Eyelashes froze together. Exposed skin turned white, then black. Frostbite was common, amputations frequent, and still the work went on. Yet even in this frozen hell, there were moments of humanity. Prisoners shared stories at night, huddled in bunks for warmth. Some managed to smuggle in books or scraps of paper, secretly writing poetry or keeping journals. Music was forbidden, but sometimes a guard might look away while someone hummed a tune. Memory kept people alive, the memory of family, of a life before arrest, of a belief that this nightmare could not last forever. There were also acts of quiet resistance. Some prisoners sabotaged tools to delay work. Others stole official forms to rewrite quotas and protect the weakest among them. And in rare instances, prisoners escaped, though escape often meant wandering into thousands of miles of uncharted wilderness with no food and no map. Most escapees died, but even the attempt was a form of defiance. The Gulag was not only a place of suffering, but of survival, of the human spirit being tested to its absolute limit. The sheer scale of the Gulag system, millions of prisoners, thousands of camps, can be overwhelming. But behind every statistic was a life, a person with memories, dreams, and a family, a person whose world was shattered by the knock on the door in the middle of the night. To truly understand the Gulag, we must listen to their voices. Let us begin with the story of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, perhaps the most famous survivor of the Soviet labor camps. A decorated Red Army officer, Solzhenitsyn was arrested in 1945 for writing letters that criticized Joseph Stalin. He was sentenced to 8 years in the camps. His experience and his later writings would expose the inner workings of the Gulag to the world. Solzhenitsyn was first sent to a labor camp in Kazakhstan, where he worked in construction. His days were a blur of endless shoveling and lifting. He remembered prisoners collapsing from exhaustion, left where they fell. Guards jeered at them, calling them enemies of the people. Solzhenitsyn survived in part by using his mind, memorizing verses of poetry, secretly composing essays in his head. He later described how the human spirit could endure almost anything if it refused to submit. After his release, he would go on to write the Gulag Archipelago, a monumental work that combined memoir, history, and testimony from hundreds of other prisoners. Published in the West, it was banned in the USSR, but it helped to dismantle the myth of the Soviet paradise and earned him the Nobel Prize in Literature. Another voice that rises from the past is that of Evgenia Ginsburg, a school teacher from Kazan. In 1937, during the Great Purge, she was accused of being part of a counter-revolutionary group. Her trial was quick, her sentence severe, 18 years in labor camps. Ginsburg endured solitary confinement, brutal interrogations, and a long journey to the Kolyma region, one of the coldest and most lethal parts of the Gulag. In her memoir, Journey into the Whirlwind, she described how prisoners were transported in sealed cattle cars, deprived of light and air. She wrote of frostbite, of women screaming in the dark, of the terrifying silence that fell when someone stopped moving. But she also wrote of small acts of kindness, a fellow prisoner slipping her a crust of bread, a nurse who risked punishment to provide real medicine. These moments, she said, were lifelines. They reminded her that not all humanity had been extinguished. Then there was Varlam Shalamov, a writer whose time in the Gulag nearly killed him. He spent over 15 years in various camps, most of them in the infamous Kolyma region. Shalamov's view of the Gulag was darker than even Solzhenitsyn's. In his Kolyma Tales, he painted a portrait of a world without mercy, where men were stripped of everything: dignity, morality, even identity. Shalamov believed that the Gulag was not a place of reformation, but of destruction. He wrote, "There are no such things as former prisoners. One's time in the camps marks a person forever." Another, deeply moving account comes from Lev Razgon, a Soviet journalist who was imprisoned in the 1930s. Unlike many others, Razgon survived to see the fall of the Soviet Union and gave interviews about his experiences late in life. He spoke of the absurdity of his arrest. He had worked for the Soviet state, believed in its ideals, and yet he was thrown into a cell without explanation. He described the feeling of betrayal, the long hours spent standing in line for food, the hopelessness that clung to every corner of the camp. But he also described survival strategies, finding purpose in small routines, creating imaginary conversations with loved ones, drawing mental maps of his home village. He said, "The moment you stop imagining a future, you begin to die." These stories, and thousands like them, reveal the emotional complexity of life in the Gulag. There was suffering, yes, but also resistance. There was dehumanization, but also moments of profound human connection. Many prisoners, after their release, carried scars, not just on their bodies, but on their souls. Some never spoke of their experiences. Others, like Solzhenitsyn and Ginsberg, felt a duty to bear witness, to speak for those who could not. Even among the guards and camp officials, there were shades of grey. Some were brutal, sadistic. Others were themselves victims of a system that punished dissent with exile or death. In rare cases, guards helped prisoners, slipping them food, warning them of inspections, looking the other way when they rested. And what of the families left behind? Wives and children were often labelled enemies of the people by association. They lost their homes, their jobs, their social standing. Children grew up not knowing where their parents were, or if they were even alive. The Gulag didn't just imprison individuals. It cast a shadow over entire families for generations. Each story adds a thread to the vast tapestry of the Gulag, a network of suffering, yes, but also of resilience, of survival, and of quiet defiance. These voices demand to be remembered. They remind us that history is not made only by leaders and armies, but by ordinary people, caught in extraordinary times, who endured, who resisted, and who, against all odds, refused to be broken. As we journey further into the human heart of the Gulag, it becomes clear that no social class, no profession, no corner of Soviet society was immune to its reach. One such story is that of Nadezhda Mandelstam, wife of the poet Osip Mandelstam. Osip was arrested for composing a short poem mocking Stalin, a poem he dared to recite only to close friends. But even whispers in the Soviet Union had weight. He was arrested in 1934, exiled, and later rearrested during the Great Purge. His second arrest marked the end. He died in a transit camp near Vladivostok in 1938, starved and broken. Nadezhda spent years evading arrest herself, living in fear, moving from city to city. After the war, she devoted her life to preserving her husband's work and telling the world his story. Her memoirs remain some of the most poignant testimonies of life under Stalin. Another chilling story is that of Sofia Petrovna, a fictional character created by writer Lydia Chukovskaya. Though the novel's emotional truth is deeply rooted in reality, Sofia is a loyal Soviet widow working as a typist in Leningrad. Her son, an engineer, is arrested during the purges. As Sofia tries to understand the logic of his arrest, she finds herself swallowed by the contradictions and madness of the system. Written in secret and hidden away for decades, the novel captures the psychological descent of a woman betrayed by the very ideology she once believed in. Though fictional, Sofia Petrovna's story was shared by thousands of mothers across the Soviet Union. Then there is Janusz Bardak, a young Polish medical student swept into the Red Army during World War II. After being accused of counter-revolutionary speech, he was sentenced to hard labor in the Gulag. He survived brutal treatment, near starvation, and a near-fatal accident before eventually being transferred to a prison hospital. His memoir, Man is Wolf to Man, details his journey from blind loyalty to bitter clarity, a transformation shared by many who passed through the camps. He described arriving at his first camp and seeing prisoners who no longer looked human, their eyes sunken, their movements slow, their hope gone. Many prisoners, like Janusz, clung to language. Words were survival, a poem remembered, a joke told under breath, a note passed from hand to hand. In a system designed to erase identity, words became a form of resistance. And what of the artists? Dmitri Shostakovich, the composer, was never imprisoned, but he lived in terror of arrest for much of his career. Friends disappeared overnight. He kept a packed suitcase by the door for years, expecting the knock that never came. His music, mournful and explosive, became a silent chronicle of fear, survival, and mourning. Others were not so lucky. Painters, sculptors, musicians. Many were arrested for formalism, bourgeois decadence, or the vague but deadly crime of pessimism. Among the less remembered names is Varvara Bakhmetieva, an elderly peasant woman arrested for speculation, that is, selling vegetables from her own garden at a local market without a state permit. She was sentenced to 5 years. In the camp, she became known as Babushka Varvara, the grandmother of the barracks. She would tell fairy tales to the younger women at night, soothing them to sleep with the voice of a more peaceful world. She died during her 3rd winter in the camp, her body buried under the snow. And then there was Father Dmitry Dodko, an Orthodox priest, arrested for holding private discussions about faith. Religion in the USSR was suppressed, but many clung to it quietly. In the camps, faith became a refuge. Dudko held secret liturgies at night, whispering prayers to small groups of men who longed for comfort in the darkness. After his release, he became one of the few voices of Christian dissent within the Soviet Union, speaking out even under surveillance. The Gulag was not only a prison for bodies, it was a prison for ideas, for art, for thought, for belief. Yet, despite its cruelty, the Gulag failed in one fundamental goal. It could not destroy the human spirit. It could starve the body, isolate the mind, break the bones. But in its vast system of punishment, it also created something else. A silent archive of bravery, of dignity, and of voices that refused to die. These stories, passed down through memoirs, whispered through generations, or written on scraps of paper, smuggled across borders, are what remain. They are our connection to a past that must never be forgotten. A reminder that even in the darkest of nights, there are those who continue to speak. It may seem unthinkable today, but the Gulag was not viewed by the Soviet state merely as a system of punishment. It was also a business, a cold, calculated, and sprawling enterprise rooted in exploitation. In fact, one of the central justifications for its existence, at least within Stalin's inner circle, was economic. The Gulag was meant to power the Soviet Union's industrial revolution, and in many ways, it did. The camps were not just places of imprisonment. They were factories, mines, forests, and construction sites. By the 1930s, the Gulag had grown into an institutional behemoth with its own budget, administrators, supply chains, and infrastructure. It was managed by the NKVD, the predecessor to the KGB, and reported directly to the Soviet leadership. The sheer numbers are staggering. By 1939, there were over 1.5 million prisoners in the system. By the early 1950s, that number had risen to over 2.5 million. Each was expected to produce, to build, to dig, to endure. Let us begin with the Belomor Canal, one of the Gulag's most infamous projects. It was commissioned by Stalin to connect the White Sea to the Baltic Sea, a grand engineering feat that would serve both commercial and military purposes. But the conditions under which it was built were nightmarish. Between 1931 and 1933, over 100,000 prisoners were forced to dig the 141-mile canal, mostly by hand, with picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows. Machinery was almost non-existent. The work was brutal. The soil was frozen. The pace was relentless. Officially, over 12,000 workers died during the project. Unofficial estimates place the number far higher, and the final canal was so shallow and narrow that it could barely support large ships. But it served its true purpose, as a symbol of forced labor's efficiency, hailed by the Soviet press as a triumph of socialism. And then there was Kolyma, the name that came to symbolize death itself in the Gulag system. Located in the Far East, Kolyma was rich in gold. The Soviet regime, desperate for hard currency, saw the region as a treasure chest waiting to be cracked open. But the landscape was remote, rugged, and locked in permafrost. Who would work there? Prisoners. Tens of thousands were shipped to Kolyma every year. They lived in tents or makeshift huts, enduring temperatures that dropped below -50 degrees Celsius. With little food and inadequate clothing, they were marched into the wilderness to mine gold from the frozen earth. Each ounce dug from the ground meant more wealth for the state, and more death for those who uncovered it. Prisoners were frequently worked to death. Bodies were buried where they fell, sometimes used to reinforce roadbeds. The Road of Bones, they called it. Gold wasn't the only prize. The Gulag also fueled the extraction of coal, timber, oil, and minerals. Entire cities in the Soviet far north, such as Vorkuta, Norilsk, and Magadan, began as Gulag settlements. Their factories and streets were laid by prisoners. Their power stations built by hands in chains. In the forests of Siberia, prisoners worked in lumber camps. Each man was expected to cut down a specific number of trees per day. Falling short meant food rations were cut, a slow death sentence. The timber was then used in Soviet construction or exported to Europe for hard currency. Even paper made in the USSR could be traced back to the camps. Railroads, too, were built by forced labor. One of the most ambitious was the Baikal-Amur Main Line, or BAM, a massive rail route through Siberia. Though incomplete during Stalin's time, its early stages were marked by the deaths of thousands. The terrain was so difficult that entire sections had to be rebuilt repeatedly. But prisoners kept coming, generation after generation. The regime portrayed these projects as heroic. In newspapers and propaganda films, prisoners were called re-educated men, transformed through labor. Smiling faces were painted on murals. Statues commemorated their supposed dedication to socialism. But inside the camps, reality was quite different. The work was inefficient. Sabotage was common. Morale was non-existent. Guards had to constantly monitor prisoners to prevent escape or suicide. Equipment was outdated. Projects took far longer than anticipated. But none of this mattered to the regime. Labor was cheap, replaceable, dispensable. The Soviet state had effectively turned suffering into an economic engine. Gulag camps even competed with each other. Regional directors were given quotas and rewarded for exceeding production goals, regardless of the cost in human lives. Those who failed might find themselves prisoners in the very camps they once managed. There were internal markets too. Prisoners who managed to carve wooden trinkets or perform basic repairs could trade favors for food, tobacco, or clothing. Corruption was rampant. Guards took bribes. Officials diverted supplies. The lines between criminal and administrator blurred. Yet, despite its economic role, the Gulag never truly succeeded as a rational system of production. In fact, many Soviet economists and planners admitted in private that the camps were economically inefficient. Forced labor produced results, but at a high cost, both materially and morally. The true function of the Gulag was not industry, it was control. Still, the legacy remains. Even today, many railways, mines, and buildings in the former Soviet Union were built on bones, the bones of those who labored, suffered, and perished without recognition. The economy of the Gulag was an economy of silence, of hidden ledgers and unmarked graves. It was the price of terror, the cost of empire. Behind the physical toil and frozen landscapes of the Gulag stood something colder still, the bureaucratic system that made it all possible. At its heart was a paradox, a monstrous contradiction between official Soviet ideology and the grim realities of life in the camps. The Soviet Union, after all, claimed to be a workers' state, a paradise for the proletariat, a land where exploitation had ended and where the laborer was king. But inside the Gulag, workers were treated as expendable. The same regime that celebrated the dignity of labor created a system that turned human beings into tools. And yet, this contradiction was never openly acknowledged. Instead, it was masked in layers of ideological language. The camps were not prisons, but corrective labor colonies. Prisoners were not inmates, but citizens undergoing re-education. The suffering they endured was not punishment, but a necessary step toward becoming better Soviet men and women. Propaganda painted the camps as places of transformation, where even the worst enemies of the people could be redeemed through hard work. This ideological camouflage was essential. It allowed the regime to expand the Gulag system without admitting its brutality. It turned moral questions into bureaucratic procedures. Arrests were justified, not through evidence, but through quotas. Local NKVD offices were given targets for the number of enemies to be arrested each month. These were often arbitrary: 100 kulaks here, 200 Trotskyists there. And when real enemies could not be found, innocent people were taken instead. Paperwork drove everything. A simple signature could send someone to Siberia for 10 years. A misfiled report could lead to a death sentence. The machinery of repression was fueled not by bloodlust, but by routine. And the reach of this machinery extended far beyond the camps themselves. Factories and construction sites across the Soviet Union relied on Gulag labor. Regional planning boards received detailed reports on how many prisoners would be made available for each project. Blueprints were drawn up, assuming a constant supply of forced workers. The camps were plugged into the economy like any other workforce, only cheaper and more disposable. There was also a culture of silence. Most Soviet citizens knew about the Gulag, at least vaguely. Everyone had a relative or a neighbor who had gone away. Everyone had heard whispers, but no one dared speak openly. To question the system was to risk becoming part of it. And so, the Gulag became both visible and invisible, a known unknown hidden in plain sight. Some benefited from the system. Informants, guards, camp administrators, all were rewarded with bonuses, promotions, housing. Ordinary citizens, too, could gain. Apartments of the arrested were reassigned to loyal party members. Their clothes and possessions were often sold at state shops. The spoils of repression were spread widely, helping to create a population invested, however quietly, in the system's continuation. Even the scientific and cultural elite were implicated. During the height of the purges, entire academic disciplines were gutted. Linguists, biologists, and historians were arrested en masse, accused of bourgeois idealism or anti-Soviet agitation. Yet some scientists and engineers continued their work inside the Gulag. These were the so-called sharashkas, secret research labs located inside prison camps, where imprisoned specialists were forced to develop weapons, aircraft, and technology for the state. Famous figures such as the aircraft designer Andrei Tupolev and the rocket engineer Sergei Korolev were among those imprisoned and later rehabilitated, their brilliance too valuable to waste entirely, yet not trusted enough to be free. It was a grotesque twist. The same state that destroyed its intellectual class then used them behind barbed wire to fuel its military ambitions. The Gulag was not an aberration of the Soviet system. It was an essential part of it. It served multiple purposes at once: economic, political, psychological. It was a labor force, a method of social control, and a terrifying symbol. It reminded the population of the price of disobedience, and it created an entire universe governed by fear. But it was also, in many ways, a failure. Projects were delayed. Materials were wasted. Corruption flourished. The toll in human life was astronomical. Even Soviet planners began to question whether the costs outweighed the gains. Still, the system endured for decades, not because it was efficient, but because it worked in a deeper, darker way. It kept people afraid. It destroyed opposition. It held the illusion of progress together with iron chains. It was not just a prison for bodies. It was a prison for truth. No system, no matter how vast or deeply rooted, can last forever. Even the Gulag, once seen as an eternal part of Soviet life, began to crack. Not from within, but from the top. The death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953 was the turning point. It sent shockwaves through the Soviet Union, not just politically, but psychologically. For nearly 3 decades, Stalin had been more than a leader. He had been a symbol, a father, a god, and a terror all at once. His name was on buildings, statues, songs, and behind that name was the machinery of fear. With his death, the regime faced a problem: how to move forward without dismantling the entire system. The first sign of change came quickly. Within weeks, Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's feared chief of the secret police and the architect of many purges, was arrested and executed. It was a public break with the most brutal aspects of the past, and a signal that reform might be possible. By the end of 1953, over 1 million prisoners were released from the camps. These early releases were mostly for non-political offenders, those arrested for theft, small infractions, or military desertion. But the momentum had begun. Families who had not heard from loved ones in years began receiving letters. Others returned home to find their apartments occupied, their names erased from public records. The next major shift came in 1956, when Nikita Khrushchev, now the Soviet leader, delivered what would become one of the most important speeches in Soviet history. His secret speech to the 20th Party Congress. In it, he denounced Stalin's cult of personality, his abuses of power, and, crucially, the terror of the purges and the labor camps. The speech was never intended for the public, but it spread like wildfire. Copies were passed hand to hand. People wept as they read the words. Some refused to believe it. Others were relieved, finally feeling that their suffering had been acknowledged. This marked the beginning of de-Stalinization. Throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s, tens of thousands more prisoners were released. Many were officially rehabilitated, their names cleared, their records expunged. Memorial plaques were quietly added to former prison buildings. Streets once named after NKVD officials were renamed. Stalin statues began to disappear, first from towns, then from cities, then even from Red Square itself. And yet, the Gulag did not vanish overnight. Some camps remained open into the 1970s and even the early 1980s, though they were much smaller and more closely monitored. Political prisoners continued to be arrested, especially under Leonid Brezhnev, who cracked down on dissidents, artists, and human rights activists. The old tools of repression, surveillance, forced labor, psychiatric detention, were still in use, though the rhetoric had softened. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that the full extent of the Gulag was revealed to the world. Archives were opened, documents declassified, former prisoners gave interviews, published memoirs, held memorial services. Monuments were erected, modest ones, often funded by survivors themselves. But even in the post-Soviet era, the memory of the Gulag remained contested. In Russia, some embraced the truth. School books were revised. Museums were built, like the Gulag History Museum in Moscow. The organization Memorial, founded by former dissidents, became the leading voice for preserving the memory of repression. It documented mass graves, published biographies of the disappeared, and fought for justice. Yet others sought to minimize the past. Nostalgia for Stalin began to grow. Polls showed many Russians viewed him not as a tyrant, but as a strong leader who modernized the country. State media downplayed the scale of the Gulag. Some officials claimed it was a necessary part of national development. The memory of the Gulag became a battleground between those who sought truth and those who preferred silence. Survivors grew old. Many died without ever seeing justice. Their children and grandchildren continued the work of remembrance, but their voices were not always welcome. Still, the truth remained. In books, in testimonies, in abandoned barracks, deep in the Siberian woods. The skeletons of watchtowers, the rusted chains, the mass graves overgrown with moss, all of it remains, silent and waiting. Today, to speak of the Gulag is not just to recall a historical tragedy. It is to engage with the deeper question: how does a society remember its crimes? How do we honor those who were silenced? How do we ensure that such a system built on fear, silence, and dehumanization never rises again? The answers are not simple, but they begin with memory, with listening, with telling the stories of those who endured, not as numbers, but as human beings. The Gulag was vast. It covered the map like a scar, but it did not destroy everything. In the end, what remains is not just suffering, but survival, and the promise, whispered across time, that the world can be better. For those released from the Gulag, freedom did not mean the end of suffering. In fact, for many, the struggle only shifted from physical survival in the camps to psychological survival in a society that barely acknowledged what they had endured. When a prisoner was released, they were often sent into internal exile. They could not return to major cities like Moscow or Leningrad. They could not reclaim lost property. They had no access to state housing, and often no family left to return to. Their names were still tainted, their pasts still suspect. A former prisoner might find work as a janitor or factory hand. If they had been a doctor, a teacher, or an engineer before, those careers were gone. The state did not trust them, and society was not encouraged to embrace them. There were exceptions. Some individuals were quietly reinstated. A few even returned to positions of prestige, but most lived quietly in the margins. They avoided drawing attention. They had learned that speaking too openly could bring danger, even years after release. Many survivors chose silence. They did not speak of what they had seen, even to their own children. The memories were too painful, and the fear too deeply rooted. It was not just about trauma, it was about conditioning. In the Gulag, speech could get you killed. That instinct never fully faded. This silence became generational. Children of former prisoners grew up sensing that something had happened, something dark, but without the words to describe it. They saw the scars, but not the wound. Only later, as adults, would many begin to piece together the truth. A few, however, broke the silence. In the 1960s and 70s, as Soviet censorship softened slightly, a new wave of literature began to emerge. Memoirs, short stories, underground publications, often circulated in secret, sometimes smuggled abroad. Writers like Varlam Shalamov, Evgenia Ginsberg, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn gave voice to the voiceless. Their words shocked readers, not just because of the suffering they described, but because they shattered the myth of the infallible state. They revealed that the repression had not been a mistake, it had been the system. This revelation caused unease. Some readers rejected it. Others could not believe it. But the truth, once spoken, could not be unheard. Still, even as memoirs gained traction, public monuments, remained rare. There were no national days of mourning for Gulag victims, no state museums, no official apology from the government. The past remained buried, figuratively and in many cases literally. Mass graves from the Stalin era continued to be discovered into the 1990s and 2000s. Some were exhumed. Others were reburied quietly. Local communities held vigils. Names were read aloud. Flowers were placed. But these acts of remembrance were often organized by ordinary people, not by the state. In Russia today, the legacy of the Gulag is still unresolved. Organizations like Memorial have done heroic work in preserving records, compiling victim lists, and educating the public. They have created digital archives, oral histories, and interactive maps of camp locations. But they face opposition. In recent years, Memorial has been targeted by the government, labeled a foreign agent, and forced to close its offices. Their work continues, but under threat. The state prefers a different narrative, one that emphasizes Soviet victory in World War II, industrial progress, and national pride, while downplaying the horrors of repression. This selective memory is dangerous. It creates a version of history that erases victims and glorifies oppressors. It tells young people that power is to be respected, even when it silences truth. And yet, resistance to this forgetting endures. Each year, on October 30th, former prisoners and their descendants gather for the Return of the Names ceremony. In cities across Russia and beyond, people read the names of Gulag victims one by one into the cold autumn air. It is a simple act, quiet, unofficial, but powerful. It says, "You are not forgotten. We remember." Because memory is not just about the past. It is about who we choose to be now, what we choose to protect, what kind of world we want to build. The Gulag is no longer a place on a map, but its echoes remain. In the way societies deal with dissent, in the fear that lingers beneath silence, and in the courage it takes to speak the truth. This is the long shadow of the camps, and it is one we must continue to confront. The story of the Gulag is one of brutality and control. But it is not an isolated story. Across time and geography, humans have built systems that used suffering as a foundation. To understand the Gulag fully, we must place it in the broader history of forced labor, and consider what it tells us about the societies that created such systems. First, we must acknowledge a sobering truth. The use of captivity and forced labor is not unique to any one country, ideology, or century. It is a dark thread that runs through civilizations from ancient empires to modern regimes. In ancient Egypt, slaves hauled stones to build pyramids, magnificent monuments whose glory was underpinned by pain. In Rome, captives from across the empire labored in fields, quarries, and households. They had no rights, only the will of their masters to obey. In the early modern world, the transatlantic slave trade transformed forced labor into a global industry. Millions of Africans were kidnapped, sold, and transported across oceans to work on plantations in the Americas. Families were torn apart, cultures were erased, generations were lost. It was one of the most massive and dehumanizing systems of labor exploitation ever built. Centuries later, under different banners, new systems emerged, with new justifications, but the same disregard for human dignity. In Nazi Germany, forced labor became an essential part of the war economy. Jews, Roma, political dissidents, and prisoners of war were rounded up and made to work under appalling conditions. Many were worked to death in concentration camps and factories. The scale and cruelty of the Holocaust stands apart in history, but its labor apparatus mirrored that of the Gulag in one chilling way. It was justified as necessary, efficient, patriotic. In Maoist China, during the Cultural Revolution, and under the system known as Laogai, short for reform through labor, millions were imprisoned and forced to work. Like in the Soviet Union, these prisoners included intellectuals, farmers, religious minorities, and even children. They dug ditches, manufactured goods, and harvested crops, all in the name of ideological purity. Many never returned. Even in the United States, forced labor has a long and painful legacy. Beyond the era of slavery, African Americans were often imprisoned under dubious charges during Reconstruction and forced to work in what became known as convict leasing, a system where prisoners were essentially rented out to private companies. They built railroads, worked in mines, and died in alarming numbers, with few protections or rights. All of these systems, ancient and modern, communist and capitalist, religious and secular, have one thing in common. They reduce human beings to tools, to economic units, to problems to be managed rather than lives to be honored. What distinguishes the Gulag is the scale and ideological complexity behind it. The Soviet Union did not merely tolerate forced labor, it celebrated it. It wrapped it in the language of progress, of redemption, of state building. It used it not just to punish, but to reshape society. The prisoner was not just a criminal, but a symbol, a warning, a lesson, a cog in a larger narrative. And yet, despite the ideological differences, the outcomes were tragically familiar. Exhaustion, death, silence. So what lessons can we draw from this grim history? First, forced labor, in all its forms, thrives in the absence of accountability. It requires secrecy, fear, and systems that place ideology or profit above people. When there are no checks on power, When entire categories of people are dehumanized, these systems can emerge anywhere. Second, the language used to justify repression matters. It begins with small phrases: enemy of the people, necessary sacrifice, corrective labor. These words sound bureaucratic, neutral, even virtuous, but they open the door to horror. They allow ordinary people to become complicit, not out of malice, but out of obedience, or fear, or simply the habit of not asking questions. Third, remembrance is resistance. Forgetting is the final victory of the oppressor. When survivors' voices are silenced, when memorials are destroyed, when education omits the past, the conditions for future atrocities are quietly rebuilt. Memory must be protected, not just in museums and textbooks, but in culture, conversation, and consciousness. Finally, we must recognize the resilience of those who endured. Despite everything, the chains, the hunger, the exile, millions resisted not with weapons, but with will. They told stories, they kept diaries, they passed down songs. They survived, not just for themselves, but for the generations that would follow. The Gulag is over, but the conditions that allowed it to exist, authoritarianism, fear, indifference, are not gone. They can return. They often do. So we remember not just to mourn, but to prevent, to honor those who suffered by building a world where such suffering is no longer possible. And that begins here, tonight, by listening. Long before the archives were opened and the historians compiled their reports, the Gulag lived on in whispers and in art. For many years, the only way the world could glimpse the truth of the Soviet labor camps was through the creativity and courage of writers, filmmakers, poets, and painters. In a state where the truth was forbidden, art became a form of resistance. No figure stands taller in this realm than Alexander Solzhenitsyn. His writing was a lifeline for memory, not just for the West, but for the Soviet Union itself. His novel, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, published in 1962 with Khrushchev's temporary approval, was the first time a Soviet citizen could read a realistic depiction of camp life in official print. It described a single day in a typical prisoner's life. The cold, the hunger, the monotony, the subtle humiliations. There were no dramatic escapes, no heroic rebellions, just survival, quiet, brutal, and real. The novel caused a sensation. Readers recognized its truth instantly. Some wept. Others were stunned into silence. A door had been cracked open, but it was Solzhenitsyn's magnum opus, the Gulag Archipelago, that truly changed the landscape. Published abroad in 1973, it was an explosive, encyclopedic work based on hundreds of personal testimonies, documents, and his own memories. It was not only a chronicle of suffering, but a philosophical meditation on evil, complicity, and the soul's ability to endure. The Soviet government saw it as a threat and expelled Solzhenitsyn from the country in 1974. But the book had already begun to circulate in underground copies, passed from hand to hand, read by flashlight in hidden rooms. It became a sacred text for the dissident movement, a monument in words. Other writers followed. Varlam Shalamov's Kolyma tales presented a darker, more unflinching vision. For Shalamov, the camps were not places of redemption. They were places where human dignity was systematically stripped away. His stories were short, stark, often fragmented. They mirrored the psychological disintegration he had witnessed and experienced. "A man who has been in the camps," he wrote, "is no longer a man." Evgenia Ginsberg's memoir, Journey into the Whirlwind, gave a woman's voice to the Gulag. Her prose was lyrical, precise, and deeply emotional. She described the interrogations, the prison train, the freezing labor, and above all, the endurance required to keep one's mind intact. Outside the Soviet Union, these works shaped global understanding of the regime. They became the foundation for academic studies, documentaries, and human rights campaigns. But they also did something more profound. They made the suffering intimate, personal, unforgettable. Film, too, played a role, though with far more restrictions. In the Soviet Union, few films dared to touch the Gulag directly. It wasn't until the perestroika era of the 1980s that filmmakers began exploring the topic with any depth. One of the first was Repentance, 1984, directed by Tengiz Abuladze. Though metaphorical and surreal, the film presented a clear allegory of Stalinist repression and the cult of personality. It was banned until 1987, but once released, it caused a national conversation. Audiences flooded theaters. People stayed afterward to talk, to cry, to remember. In the West, films like The Inner Circle, 1991, and The Way Back, 2010, offered cinematic interpretations of Soviet oppression, sometimes dramatized, sometimes historical. While not always accurate in detail, these films brought the emotional weight of the camps to wider audiences. Visual artists also responded. Painters like Dmitry Plavinsky and Tatiana Nazarenko created haunting images, distorted figures, barbed wire landscapes, faceless crowds. Their work captured the emotional texture of repression, not the literal barracks or uniforms, but the fear, the silence, the weight. In recent years, memorial architecture has emerged as a cultural form in itself. Simple monuments of stone and steel, wall-mounted plaques listing names. The Solovki stone, a boulder from one of the earliest camps, now placed in Lubyanka Square, across from the old KGB headquarters, stands as a stark reminder. There are also performance pieces. In 2015, a group of Russian artists staged a reading of the Gulag archipelago in a Moscow theater. It was quiet, solemn, and deeply moving. People wept in the audience. For many, it was their first encounter with the book, and with this part of their history. Cultural memory is powerful because it is emotional. It bypasses statistics. It defies censorship. It touches the heart. And yet, it is fragile. In recent years, censorship has returned to Russia. Independent museums have lost funding. School books downplay Stalin's crimes. Public discourse is shifting. Memory is once again under threat. But art endures. New generations of writers, filmmakers, and musicians continue the work. They explore the Gulag not just as history, but as metaphor, a warning about authoritarianism, conformity, and the price of forgetting. Even outside Russia, the Gulag has entered the global imagination. References appear in novels, documentaries, plays. Survivors' voices are preserved in digital archives. Their words travel farther now than they ever could have in life. And this is how the memory lives on, not just in facts and figures, but in stories, in music, in brushstrokes, in whispered poems, in the space between silence and speech, where truth finds its voice. The morning begins not with light, but with cold. It is still dark outside when the door of the barracks creaks open. A wind rushes in. Bitter, sharp. It bites the skin like needles. There is no sunrise in this place, only a gradual brightening of the frozen grey sky. Ivan opens his eyes. He does not stretch. He does not roll over. He simply blinks, slowly. His body is stiff. His breath forms a thin cloud above him. The wooden plank beneath him is cracked, warped by years of weight and sweat. There is no mattress, only straw, old, flattened straw, full of dust and lice. He listens. A guard barks an order. Boots shuffle. Chains clink. Someone coughs. A wet, rattling sound. Someone else groans. The day has begun. Ivan sits up carefully. He does not speak. He does not look around. He has learned not to. The barracks are full. Men pressed side by side, row upon row of sleeping shelves. Most are already moving, silent as insects, dressing in the dim light. His clothes are stiff from the night air. He pulls on his coat. It is too thin. The collar is torn. His hat is missing, stolen weeks ago. He wears a rag around his ears instead. The boots on his feet do not match. One is too large, the other too tight. But they are boots, and they are his. They file out into the yard. The wind is worse now. It howls between the wooden buildings. The sky is pale, colorless. Snow covers everything, even the fences topped with barbed wire. Guards stand watch in their towers, rifles in hand, unmoving. The men gather in line. A roll call. Numbers are shouted. Names read aloud. Ivan waits for his, and when it comes, he nods. One of the guards glares at him, squinting, then moves on. Breakfast is a metal bowl of something hot, but barely nourishing. A watery gruel. It smells faintly of burnt flour. Ivan eats slowly, spoon by spoon, letting the heat stay in his mouth before swallowing. He does not complain. He does not trade. He eats everything. Soon, the work detail is called. Ivan is assigned to the logging team today. He's done this before. They walk out of camp in a line, guarded at the front and back. No one talks. The snow crunches beneath them. Frost gathers on eyebrows and lashes. The trees appear like ghosts in the distance, tall, silent. The logging site is half a mile from the barracks. Tools are handed out. A dull saw, a rusted axe, no gloves. They begin. The work is mechanical. Ivan cuts, lifts, stacks, then repeats. The trees are heavy. Each one falls with a sound like thunder, echoing through the forest. Time becomes strange. The body moves. The mind stays still. Some men work quickly, desperate to meet their quotas and earn a few more grams of bread. Others work slowly, saving their strength. There are no rewards for speed if you collapse. Ivan paces himself. His hands ache. The axe handle digs into his palms. The cold creeps through his coat. By noon, his toes are numb. They rest for 10 minutes. He leans against a stump, breathing quietly. He does not speak, but he listens. A young man nearby mutters to himself, reciting a poem from memory. Another man draws shapes in the snow with a stick. Someone further down the line hums a tune, faint, almost inaudible. The break ends. They resume. The afternoon passes in a haze. The sun never truly rises, and now it begins to fade again. Shadows lengthen, the cold deepens. A guard shouts. A man has collapsed. He is not moving. The guards curse. Another prisoner is ordered to drag him aside. Work continues. Ivan does not look. He has seen it before. As the light disappears, they are marched back. The snow glows faintly under the moon. The barracks welcome them not with warmth, but with the absence of wind. It is enough. Dinner is another bowl. This time, cabbage soup. A small piece of black bread. Ivan eats with the same slowness, the same focus. Each bite is deliberate, each swallow silent. Then a final count. Inside the barracks, the men settle. Some sleep immediately, others talk quietly. Stories of home, of books once read, of food. Haven does not talk, but he listens. He lies back on his plank. The straw scratches. His bones ache.
His hands tremble slightly, but he is alive. He has made it through another day, and that, in this place, is everything. As sleep begins to come, Haven thinks of a tree, just one, tall and green, standing in a quiet field. No snow, no noise, just the wind, gentle.
Moving the leaves. He holds that image, and finally, he sleeps. When we speak of the Gulag, we often speak of its physical realities, the cold, the hunger, the labor. But there is another reality, quieter and deeper. It is what the system did to the mind, to the self, to the soul. The psychological toll of the camps was immense, and it did not end with release. First, there was the trauma of arrest. For most, it came without warning. A knock at the door, a flash of paper, a search, a goodbye that was never allowed. This sudden rupture created lasting wounds, families torn apart in seconds, lives interrupted mid-sentence. Then came the interrogation. This was not just a demand for information. It was a process of breaking down the individual. Prisoners were isolated, deprived of sleep, subjected to intense psychological pressure, sometimes for weeks. False confessions were extracted not just through beatings, but through relentless questioning, gaslighting, humiliation. Many were forced to denounce others, friends, colleagues, even family. This betrayal, once made, haunted them forever. Even those who resisted were scarred by the ordeal. Some never trusted another person again. In the camps, psychological survival was as important as physical endurance. Prisoners had to adapt. They learned to hide their emotions, to speak carefully or not at all, to read people's faces with precision, to memorize patterns. Who could be trusted? Who couldn't? They learned to live with constant uncertainty. Would they be transferred tomorrow? Would the guard on duty be cruel or kind? Would food arrive? Would they wake up to news of a fellow inmate's death? This mental vigilance took its toll. Hyper-awareness, anxiety, insomnia. Even decades later, survivors described how they startled at sudden noises, how they could not sleep with the lights off, how they avoided crowds, how they never felt fully safe again. Some found ways to cope. Routine helped. A ritual, even a small one, folding clothes, reciting poetry, sketching on scraps of paper, could create a sense of order, of self. So did friendship. Bonds formed in the camps were unlike any others. Shared suffering created intimacy. A gesture as small as sharing a crust of bread or a whispered joke could mean everything. Many said it was these connections that kept them alive. But for others, the damage ran too deep. Some prisoners fell into apathy, a state known among inmates as camp shock. They stopped talking, stopped eating, stared at the walls for hours. For them, the psyche had simply retreated. It was a kind of death before death. After release, survivors faced new challenges. They had been changed, but the world around them often had not. Friends were gone, families scattered. The country they returned to was still filled with suspicion. Some found their homes occupied, their jobs given away. Others were told to forget, to move on. But trauma does not move on so easily. There was little therapy, little understanding. Survivors suffered from what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, though the term did not exist in the Soviet lexicon. Nightmares, flashbacks, depression. Some turned to alcohol, others withdrew completely. Even those who reintegrated into society carried the weight quietly. They avoided conversations about the past. They taught their children not to ask questions. Silence became a kind of shield. And what about the guards, the interrogators, the administrators? Some, too, were broken by what they had seen or done. Many rationalized their actions. I was following orders. I did what I had to do. Others avoided the topic altogether. Some remained loyal to the ideology until the end of their lives. The psychological legacy of the Gulag extends beyond individuals. It shaped entire generations. In Soviet society, the camps created a climate of fear and self-censorship. People learned not to speak too freely, not to question authority, to keep their heads down. This mentality lingered long after the camps were gone. Children of survivors grew up with caution woven into their DNA. They inherited the silences, the carefulness, the invisible rules. Some became activists, determined to uncover the truth. Others carried shame without knowing its source. This generational trauma is real, and it is still unfolding. Even today, in parts of Russia and the former Soviet Union, the full truth of the Gulag remains controversial. Some people argue that it's time to forget, that focusing on the past is divisive, but forgetting is not healing. True healing comes from acknowledgement, from listening, from empathy, from making space for pain and allowing it to speak. This is why the memoirs matter. The interviews, the monuments, the names carved into stone, they are not just records. They are acts of psychological restoration. They say, your suffering was real, your story matters, you are not alone. In the end, the most lasting wounds are often the ones we cannot see, but they are there, in memory, in culture, in the silence that lingers after the words have ended. And by naming them, by bringing them into the light, we begin the slow, quiet work of healing. As we bring this journey to a close, let us pause in the silence. The Gulag was a vast machinery of repression, a system that swallowed millions, a landscape carved by fear. But it was also something more, a mirror. It reflected the capacity of any state to place ideology above humanity, to turn neighbors into enemies, to convert bureaucracy into brutality. And it reflected the resilience of those who endured. When we speak of history, it is easy to become lost in numbers, to say 18 million passed through the Gulag, more than 1 million died. These are facts. They matter. But they do not tell us who those people were. They do not tell us about the teacher who recited poetry by heart each morning to remember who she was, or the young boy who sang quietly at night in the barracks to keep others from weeping, or the old man who shared his final piece of bread with a stranger. The Gulag was built to erase names, but what we do tonight, what you and I do simply by remembering, restores them. This is the quiet reckoning that history demands of us. We cannot undo what was done, but we can choose to listen, to witness, to tell the truth in a world that so often prefers silence. Because the Gulag is not just something that happened, it is something that could happen. The conditions that allowed it, fear, censorship, obedience, indifference, are not gone. They exist in every society, in every era. The line between freedom and repression is thinner than we like to believe. That is why memory matters. It is not just a look backward, it is a safeguard, a promise. The survivors of the camps are leaving us. Most are gone, but they left behind their voices in books, letters, recordings, in the eyes of their children, in the small stones placed at the edge of forgotten graves. They asked us not to forget. And so, as you rest now, as the night deepens and your breathing slows, remember this. History is not only written by the powerful, it is also whispered by the survivors, by those who endured quietly, who held on to kindness in the coldest of places, who found ways to be human, even in a system designed to crush the human spirit. Their legacy is not only in the suffering they endured, but in the fact that they endured at all. Thank you for taking this journey. May the memory of those lost live on in truth, and may we honor them, not just in words, but in the kind of world we build. Good night.